Good morning and welcome to Let's Coach 2023. I'm going to be here with you today, and my name is Lani Kim. I'm one of the coaches here on campus. So welcome or welcome back if you've been here before. Today, I was talking or thinking about narratives, stories that we have going on in our heads. And not only a narrative from a writing standpoint, right? Like a writer's narrative, but literally the narrative we have running through our heads constantly about our life. And what I wanted to encourage you to do today is think of your life like a book with chapters, which is very often an analogy we use, at least here in the States. And if you were to write that book and have some chapters in there, what would the title of those chapters be? Because that is what I want to address today. What different narratives do we have going on in our head about our life? Now, this is not to at all discount anything that is written in our book. Our story is our story. However, what I want to introduce is a different perspective into your narrative that you can include in your book. Because ultimately, we get to choose which chapter of our lives we reread, right? Which version of our lives that we reread over and over, right? And this is so important because number one, when we recognize the story that we have in our head, we can actually understand what thought and emotions are behind all of this or that story. And finding the emotions and thoughts behind it is what lets us know what needs to be addressed in the first place. Right? It's the recipe we've created in our head for a certain dish, right? So, but instead of a dish, we're creating chapters. But we can change those ingredients, or not change, but we can create new recipes, right? And so, for instance, in our household, we have a lot of food sensitivities. So I have several versions of different recipes that work with different members of the family. So, changing out dairy to non-dairy, gluten to non-gluten. But this is something you also can do with your life, is have a slightly different perspective. Now, obviously, we're not making things up, but having a different perspective, a different point of view on a time and place in your life. Now, one of the things to actually break down that story is a tool, in fact, that I use with my students. That is also a tool I use in writing classes. So this is where my different worlds met, and this was so helpful to my students to break down their stories as writers, but then in their lives also, my other students, to break down what is going on, what is the story that they've told themselves, and how does it look like to dissect the little parts of it and to get a different point of view. Okay. So what I mean by that is they got to break it down into 4 parts, the story in their head. So maybe this is a story that you've told yourself about just yourself in general. And, usually these beliefs that we have come from our childhood. So it is going to take some thought, some looking back into what is it that was the incident or the incidences? What experience was that? Was it something that happened at school once, but it ended up feeling like a big deal to you? Was it something that happened continuously or very frequently, or even intermittently, but happened along the way? Was it a relationship, that things that happened in a specific relationship that you had with yourself, or not with yourself, included you, right? So it could be a relationship with a parent, it could be a relationship with a teacher, it could be a relationship with a friend or peers in general. So examining what is that, right? And where do you notice that it's not serving you in your life? Right? We're not here to upend everything, but we are here to be honest and take a look at what narratives in our head are either keeping us stuck or not allowing us to get to where we want to be, right? So, which is a form of being stuck, but maybe it's not stuck doing the same thing, but maybe you're trying different things, but ultimately the result is the same, that you are unable to move to the next level of where you'd like to be in life. Or maybe you just want to feel better. There's something, an emotion that you keep holding on to that is burdening your experience in life in general. So these are the stories we want to look at and break down and decide what is going to be helpful for us. What's a different point of view? We don't want to negate our stories, right? There are stories and they're important to us, but we have to also think and realize that there are different points of views, and we also get to choose which of those versions of the story that we focus on. And when I say versions, I don't mean that one is right or wrong. I just mean that it's got a different perspective, right? So if you teaching, when something happens in the classroom and I ask my students for their feedback, right? They're each sitting in a different part of the classroom, so their perspective is a little bit different in the way that they tell the story. It's not that either one of them is right or wrong, it's just a different perspective, okay? So we're not here to negate anything of the story that you've been running through your head, right? But we're not here to say it's not true at all. But we're saying what is helpful and could we get a different perspective on that story? Okay, so what are the 4 parts, right? It's the backstory, it's the small moment, and the trouble, and the wrap up. So if you're familiar at all with The Model by Brooke Castillo, this is a different perspective or way to look at it. So the first one, your backstory, is really your introduction to your story, everything that you want us to know about what happened right before the story. What's important? What's happening around you even? What kind of circumstance are you in? So for the model, it'd be, what is your circumstance? What are the factual things? Okay, and write that down. And maybe even, so backstory, even including other people who are part of your narrative. Not just you, but other people in the narrative. And maybe even what is your relationship to them. then your small moment is really what is, excuse me, the action that took place before you experienced that very visceral, that very impactful action, or that the part of the experience that was very impactful and dramatic. What happened right before it, right? So maybe it was confidence, and maybe you were giving a presentation in school when, I don't know, maybe you're in 5th grade, and the reaction, or not reaction, what you observed as you're giving your presentation. Maybe you looked in the corner and someone was yawning, right? And maybe in another part of the classroom, 2 students were talking to each other, right? And the way that you interpreted that is they're bored, right? So, and then maybe, so that would be your small moment. And then the trouble is the third part. Where's really where you felt, okay, things aren't going well here, right? So maybe you started to sweat a little. Maybe you forgot the lines of your presentation because you're paying attention to everyone else and their reactions, right? Maybe, maybe you had something as part of your presentation and it fell, and maybe there's laughter from the classroom, or you felt self-conscious. And then the last part is a wrap up. What ultimately was the result of this? Did you have a fear of giving presentations? Did you try to avoid them? Did it affect your overall confidence in yourself? And maybe just not presentations, maybe even school. Maybe that story spilled out into how you feel about school and your own intelligence. So you want to write your story down. And here's why. You want to look at the different pieces of it. Now, the backstory is the backstory. The backstory is your circumstance. And that is not something you're going to change. And that's okay. But your small moments is really the powerful piece where you want to take a look at and know what are the thoughts and emotions that you had before the trouble started. This is where really perspective comes into play. And this has so much power, because when we can go into our story and we can edit it, right? Again, we don't have to negate our story, but we can add in there another perspective. Or if it helps and you want to write it totally, or, completely edit some of those sentences, that's fine too. But there's an also, right? And that we have to notice. So if you're giving this presentation in class, so maybe someone was yawning, but also, was the rest of the class paying attention? Or are we focusing only on that one person? Or maybe it's the person and the 2 friends who are talking, right? Are we only focusing on the 3 people? Or are we focusing on the whatever class size you had, the other 10 or 20 people, right? Who are paying attention? So is it there was someone yawning? Two people were talking in the middle of the presentation, and also there were 20 other people listening to me. So this is really where the power is, because you get to add that other part of the narrative, which is also going to add to the other emotions that you get to focus on, right? That really is everything that happens before the trouble and the wrap up. So we have so much power in that small moment to see the trouble very differently, and not even as trouble, right? Just something that happened. And then the result is something now we have control over. The wrap up. That can look differently now. Maybe throughout your life, it's looked one way, but now it can look different. You can extend that wrap up. But it does take getting that story out of your head onto computer, paper. I prefer paper, but computer is fine too. To see those words in front of us and to confront them, and to even know what those words are. Or sometimes we just carry it around with us so subconsciously that we feel disempowered to feel differently, because we can't pinpoint exactly what it even is that is causing us to have a lack of confidence, to feel unintelligent, to feel incapable, to feel sad, to feel hurt, whatever the emotion is behind it. So this is my invitation to you, is to ask you, where in your life does it feel like you've been carrying an emotion that has been burdensome and weighing you down? Or you know it's keeping you stuck and you want to change things. And this is not a time for judgment. This is a time for assessment, curiosity, and grace towards yourself, because a lot of these stories are from our childhood, or when we were at least very young. And we are vulnerable at that age. And all we're trying to do is survive. To have some grace and compassion for the way that you're looking at your past self. And if you're a parent, just imagine if that was your child. How would you want to comfort them? How would you want to embrace them? How would you go about showing them grace and encouraging and supporting them, right? Now, instead of your own child, just imagine that's you. Or if you have, nieces and nephews, if you don't have children, but you have nieces and nephews that you're close with and you help raise, right? Or if you're a mentor, right? And you mentor young people, how is that relationship, right? How do you encourage them? How do you support them? How do you comfort them in their times of difficulty, right? So look at yourself in that perspective. Just be curious, right? Curious, like, what is behind all of this? And is there something to add to that story that is helpful, going to help us move on? Because when we have a different story in our heads, right, the result changes. the wrap-up changes. And I'm talking about the current one, right? We're not going to go back and say, oh, I wish this could have been done differently. That's not helpful at all. And that story is what made us who we are today. And that's really important. But we can still have the desire to want to be in a different place and work towards that. So do you have 15 minutes? You've been on here with me thus far. You've had more than 15 minutes, right? So can you commit to yourself taking the time, 15 minutes, to just examine what this story is? And maybe you won't go through all the steps today, but as soon as you commit and you're curious, it'll start to open the door, and a lot of the stuff is just going to come out naturally. There's this book that recently the title was shared with me. It's in a different language, but I thought the title was different, very interesting, especially in our day and age. It's called Things You Know But Never Do. I was like, oh my goodness, that's perfect for, us currently. Everything is on the internet, right? We can know anything practically at any given time. There's ChatGPT who will do, quote unquote, our thinking for us practically, right? And so it's not information that we lack, right? But it's that gap between information and action, right? And in the middle of that is commitment. So I invite you to commit, fill that gap, right? You've got all the knowledge you need. And you've probably known this. This is what I'm introducing to you isn't blow your brains new, right? But probably a reality check of like, oh, there's narratives that I'd like to take a look at. And there's some action to be taken, right? And that gap is commitment. So can you commit to filling that gap and taking that time for yourself to examine your story? Because you're amazing and awesome. And if you want to be somewhere else in a certain aspect of your life, that 15 minutes is so worth it to take that journey to becoming the person that you want to be. All right. So thanks for being with me here. If you have any stories to share, whether it's me or another coach, not so much about us, but your story about being here on campus at Life Coach University, we love to read your stories. And if you are willing for us to share it, it's such an encouragement to other people. And you can do that by emailing us at hello@lifecoachuniversity.com. I will see you next week. Have a good weekend.